Welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist, and with me today I have, once again, the wonderful Allan Hunter, who is going to talk to us about his book, The Six Archetypes of Love. Welcome, Allan.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be talking with you again.
The Six Archetypes of Love. I loved reading it because, in essence, what you're exploring is what love actually is.
Yes.
And you were doing that by looking at six archetypes. Where did you get the idea for the six archetypes?
Well, the six archetypes, I spend quite a lot of time in one of my books called Stories We Need to Know. Reading Your Life Path in Literature as its subtitle, because it seemed to me that this was a book that needed to be written, because as I surveyed about 3,000 years of the Western canon's literature, so that's everything from Homer onwards, what became increasingly apparent was that in all great literature, or what's acknowledged to be great literature, literature that people have read and heard and have decided is saying something important. In all of that, the main character is invited on a quest, you might say, on a journey. And as the character goes on that journey, things happen. But it's not just events that happen, it's that the character is invited to encounter what ultimately turned out to be six growth points. And if the character is to arrive successfully at the end of the story, think Odysseus, for instance, he needs to go through all of the 6 points. If the character is to arrive successfully at the same conclusion in a Jane Austen novel, the character there, usually female, also needs to encounter all of these 6 archetypal points, always in order, always the same, always asking the same questions. So that was a hint to me to keep looking. And of course, what I found was this seems to be a template that exists in just about all literature that is anything close to worthwhile.
I like that idea very much. I like the idea of growth, because everybody always thinks that it's straightforward. Love is something that you feel. And yet we always, hear somebody at some point saying about somebody who purports to love them, but that's not what love is. And so, and I think very often we have this clash of expectations as to what love is. And when reading your book and we see these different growth points, what you're seeing is the definition of love changing according to the level which an individual is at. And that explains everything, I think.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that, because I think you've described it pretty well. If one is in a love situation, if one loves another individual, it's not going to stay the same forever. You hope the relationship will grow, and if it's going to grow, it may become something larger and more interesting than it was in those early days. But it strikes me a lot of people get rather bewildered when their relationship starts to grow and develop. They're not quite sure what to do about it, and that frightens some of them. My intent was to show people that a meaningful relationship will always tend to grow, and perhaps if we know roughly how it's going to grow, taking our cues from literature, which people have agreed to be a good descriptor of how we live, if we know how things are likely to grow, then we can be more prepared to embrace the changes rather than be scared by them and run away.
And that's just looking at the relationship itself and the way that it evolves and grows, without even putting into consideration there the point of growth at which the individuals in the relationship are. because because I think that that's where that juxtaposition of expectations can occur, or that clash of expectations, where one person is at one point of growth and the other is at a different point of growth. And of course, they didn't realize that when they met. And then it becomes evident as they get to know each other.
Yes, yes, that's exactly it. Unfortunately, those often make for the most painful times in relationships, when people are at different levels of awareness. And I spend quite a lot of time in the book looking at this, because there are, I shall backtrack a little, there are 6 levels or 6 marking mileposts that one can encounter. So there is the innocent, who then grows into becoming what I call the orphan. And the orphan is the person who is desperate to attach to somebody. But if that person asks important questions about who he or she is, then that individual becomes what I call the pilgrimage, the questioner. And the questioner is saying, well, what really do I want from my relationships? What matters to me? And that's very different from the orphan. And the orphan is the person who just wants something that will be comfortable. Thank you very much. Please. Nothing too dynamic or exciting. And you think, oh, that'll never be me. Except it has been each of us. We've all looked around and said, oh, I want just a comfortable relationship. And if we happen to be orphans at that stage, and we encounter the next level up, a pilgrim, someone who's questioning, it's almost as though we can't cope with it. It's like, here's someone who's questioning, what should a relationship be? I don't know, I just want it to be. So when the pilgrim finds another questioning person and they decide that this is the way their relationship needs to go, that's when they tend to put their money down, as it were, on the table and say, okay, this is the person, this is who I want to be with. And that's what I call the warrior lover. This is the person who will fight peacefully for what they believe in. This is the person who won't give up their significant other just because something difficult is getting in the way. They dig their heels in and say, this is what I want. So a warrior lover, stage 4. And as those two grow and develop and face the world, they become, you hope, wiser, because they haven't lost the questioning spirit and they haven't lost the desire of the orphan to be comfortable, but they keep redefining that. And as they do so, and perhaps an image of this might be the parent stops being just the person who is in love with the other person in their life, but the parent is someone who says, okay, now I have a family, or in however you want to, whichever ways you want to define family, where is my loyalty most closely held and how should it be managed? Because one loves one's relatives in a different way from the way one loves one's significant other. And at that point, the 5th stage comes into operation. And that's what I call the monarch pair, the king and queen. This is something we have to balance inside each of us. Can we make difficult decisions, such as stereotypical king is supposed to? And can we still be loving, such as the stereotypical queen is supposed to be? Now, the royal families throughout the world have fallen well short of this ideal. I'm talking here in symbolic terms. And can we meld the two, that ability to make hard decisions, tough decisions, to be stern when necessary, and yet be stern with mercy? Can we do that within ourselves, no matter whether we're male or female? So at that point, the monarch pair is, you might say, the wise parent pair working together. But also you have to have those same balance of powers within yourself. You can't rely on the other person to be merciful while you are stern. It doesn't work that way. Families like that get into a terrible mess. And finally, the sixth level, which we're all capable of being, is the magician. And the magician is defined not as someone who casts a spell, but as someone who allows the best to emerge in other people. That's a very different concept, isn't it? It's right there actually in Harry Potter. You know, the bad guys cast spells which imprison and hurt, and the good guys give space so that people can be the best version of themselves that they can be. You know, that's Dumbledore, really, isn't it? He doesn't tell Harry what to do. He gives him the space to make his own decisions about what he's going to do. And in fact, at some point before the end, Dumbledore dies. And Harry has to take the lessons he's learned and become a real magician himself. Not a spellcaster, but someone who can change the energy. Now, in that instance, what you have in love is someone who can look at those around them and see the disputes and see the anxieties and allow those people to set those anxieties and fears aside and bring out the best part of themselves. Not easy to do. Not easy to do. We can all do it, but it's very hard to stay in that place. I've known a few people who can do it, and most of them seem to be grandparents. They seem to be able to stand back and just say, let's just bring our best selves to the table here. What would that look like? They're not telling people what to do, they're allowing people to mobilize their own abilities. So that's a brief and rather ragged overview of the 6 stages, because the very first stage, which we've skipped over purposely, the very first stage is what I call the innocent. And the innocent is best visualized as a child who loves and trusts. And those are wonderful, wonderful qualities. But if you meet another person and you love and you trust them too quickly, it might be that they're not as lovable and as trustworthy as you hope. And that leads to terrible, terrible things. Very unhappy relationships.
Yes, I think just listening to you outlining them again, wonderfully succinctly, there's so many thoughts that were just running through my mind. The first, of course, is that the problem comes, and I see this with so many of my clients, it comes when they are so hungry to feel loved that they will settle at best, or in more extreme cases, put up with abusive behavior, just in the hope that somehow, at some point, that person is going to give them the love that they need. And I recognize that as you were talking about the orphan that needs to attach. This is the person who, as what you would call the innocent, too early on, that was lost, that sense of innocence, because they were damaged or they never felt the love from the parents. And then their life becomes a quest to feel that love, except they don't value themselves enough. And they end up either settling or, at worst, in worst case scenarios, being abused because they have so little sense of self-worth. And I think that's the issue with the orphan, is that feeling of being lost. And you were talking about the need to attach. Yes, it's certainly a very strong need to attach when you're feeling lost.
Yes, indeed. Again, you've outlined it very, very beautifully there. This is what I see with my clients as well, that there are so many who are so eager, desperate to attach to just about anything, that they usually choose poorly. because desperation tends to attract another kind of desperation or a different kind of exploitation. So the orphan archetype is actually quite a dangerous one. And either we learn from this, either we learn by asking the questions such as, is this really the person I need to be with? And how am I behaving around this person? If we don't look at that, we will most likely find ourselves as a desperately attached orphan, probably being exploited, abused, definitely being undervalued, and yet the fear of being on one's own, the fear of being left out, is palpable. One person I worked with a long time ago was thinking of leaving her fiancé, and then she said, "Yes, but then how would I ever find another one?" And I thought, well, that's orphan talk. But if we can ask the question, how would I ever find another person to love me? Then, by pursuing that, one could perhaps make headway, become a pilgrim in that difficult space of asking questions. What do I want? What do I expect? What do I deserve? So many of the people I deal with have quite a lot of orphan problem trailing around behind them, which is why, of course, they go from one inadequate relationship to another inadequate relationship. Orphans attract orphans sometimes, and that means that they become almost caricatures of who they could be.
It must be said as well that it could also be orphans become abusers themselves because they're so afraid of the loss that they're desperate to control the other person.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. Orphans are so desperate that they will try to control or pin the other person into a weaker situation. And you see this in relationships all the time. You just have to listen to the way people talk to each other. Do they address each other as equal human beings? Or does one say to the other, "Oh, babe," which I've heard in my practice many times. Oh, by calling someone a babe, one is already reducing them to less than a fully fledged human being. Oh, is that what you want the person to be? And so that's the edge of controlling there, isn't it? Or someone who says of their significant other, "Oh, I just have to put up with all the mistakes you make." Sort of patronizing or matronizing, perhaps. But it's the thin edge of what can become very ugly later.
I like the idea or the name that you've given to this stage, the orphan, because I think it's very apt. If you saw a child wandering around on their own, that you would know that they're in danger, and you would know that you would immediately know that they're vulnerable, and I think that is the emotional state that we are in, and we all go through this stage at various levels or at various times in our lives. It's that sense of vulnerability, and it's just that some of us get stuck there, and it's when we get stuck there that we're in trouble, because it carries on through the years, so that we might, the orphan stage might be, let's say, an appropriate stage of development during adolescence, but we don't want to get stuck there. That's the problem, that we don't want to get stuck there.
No, the idea is to see the stage, to learn its lessons. Attachment is good. Attachment is very important, but not to get stuck there, to take the lessons of each stage and use them as fuel, as it were, to power one through the next stage. Otherwise, of course, people wouldn't leave home, would they? I mean, they would be orphans if they left home, but if they stay at home, they're adopted orphans. How lovely. But if you have met someone who hasn't left home, who is at the age of 60, you're often going to be looking at someone who is perhaps psychologically stunted.
I think it's you know, it's also just thinking about that sense of self-worth again. It's understanding that love should not be damaging. It, you know, if you love a person, you ought not be damaging them, nor ought you be allowing yourself to be damaged by somebody else.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about, you know, the silly arguments that we can all have. It's, you know, because those can get sorted out. It's the almost systematic or habitual, I think that's a good word, the habitual damaging behavior that some people engage in. That's, you know, that's what we're talking about here, that is not love. And I think people need to understand that when they're stuck and they're thinking, this is what it is, or this is all that I could have. It's, if you want to leave that orphan stage, if you want to have personal growth, and this is a very spiritual thing. It's we're talking about it in romantic terms, but this is spiritual growth too, because you have to be able to say, I am worth more than this, and then breathe and grow as you say that. Nothing is worth the degradation or the loss of my integrity. That's very powerful to think of it in those terms.
Yeah, most definitely, yes. I'll perhaps give you a concrete example of this, real example from my days when I was teaching exploratory writing in college. And I was in this class, and they were all very excited, and there was a slightly older woman there, older than the average 21-year-old. She was maybe 30 something, and she was all very excited by the class, and we were doing this writing, asking questions. And then one day she said, I'd like to bring my husband to the class. And I said, sure, why not? You know, we're not doing anything unusually odd here. And I said, well, why do you want to bring him? And she said, well, I told him about this class and he wants to see what we do. So in he came at the next class, and he sat beside her, and he looked very grim. Nice gentleman, but he looked rather grim. And we went through the class and had a reasonable time, it seemed to me. And then 2 days later, she came to see me in my office, and she said, I have to drop your class. I said, oh, you know, why? You're doing really well. You're writing interesting stuff. You're asking good questions. And she said, well, I have to leave because my husband doesn't like what I'm doing. I said, really? It's only a class. This isn't a religious cult or anything. She said, no, he's very frightened by what I'm doing in the class and the things I'm learning. And he wants me to stop, and I'm going to. And so I didn't try to argue her out of it. And I knew then that she was stopping learning. She dropped out of college altogether because she was afraid it would destroy her marriage. And she was afraid it would destroy her marriage because her husband couldn't face the possibility that she would change and grow and become perhaps a fuller version of herself. I don't think the marriage survived. I don't think that once learning starts, you can stop it in its tracks like that. But she was moving from an orphan situation towards asking important questions, the pilgrim situation. And I'm very sorry for her plight. I certainly didn't intend any harm to anyone, but it did seem to me that what had happened was something within the relationship had been uncovered, which was just too uncomfortable. And that was they both settled. And he was going to be the one who told her what to do. So as a marriage, well, I'm sure it could have lasted for many years, but would it have been the best version of who these people were? I doubt it. So that's a true example.
And of course, we're talking about this in terms of partnerships, marriages, but the same thing can happen to children with parents who are unwilling to let the child grow, who feel that they're being in some way deposed or demoted when the child is wanting to branch out and grow into the world. And they're very much controlled and held back by parents too. So I guess we would say these are parents who are stuck in orphan mode and who just are too afraid to let go.
Yes. Well, I see a lot of that, of course, at the college level as well. Young people who are attending college because their parents want them to get an education and get a job that they can be proud of. And that's all very well until the young person says, well, you know, what I really want to be is a paleontologist. And mum and dad say, there's no money in it. How are you going to pay off your loans? Or if the young person says, I want to be an artist. I want to be a songwriter. There's no money. And the parents, I call this the loving trap. The parents want the best for their child, and their idea of the best is not wrong. Having a nice chunk of money and a good career is not a wrong thing to want. But if it's not true to who the child actually is, then it's not the right thing either. And so I see quite a lot of people who really, really want to be something and feel they can't be. And sometimes they go through college and they get their degree in, I don't know, accounting or business studies. And then a couple of years later, they do a master's course in something totally different, which is what they always wanted to do, they tell me. And I think at that point, well done. You broke out of the golden cage, which is really what it can be if you're an orphan who is being subjected to that sort of pressure to stay an orphan.
It's a very difficult thing because when we love a person and we want the best for them, there's that temptation to create the path for them because we're wanting to protect and guide. And actually, we need to allow people to make mistakes and to fail. You know, that is love too. And to sit back and witness it can feel like torture because you know the pain, you can see the pain coming, but you just have to let it happen up to a point. I mean, if you've got a 3-year-old, that's very different. But if we're talking about a 20-year-old, some things you do need to allow them to fall flat on their faces with, because that's life experience, and that's what's going to turn them into really great adults, with the right guidance, with the right support. That I think it's an important thing to be able to do.
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm absolutely of that line of thought because you know, I came through the English education system, and it was, at the time I was doing it, it was very tightly controlled as to what you could do and when. And what I noticed was that emerging from college with my freshly minted degree, I was surrounded by people, most of whom had no idea what they wanted to do, but they knew they were expected to do or achieve something. And these were deeply unhappy people. I was lucky. I knew what I wanted to do and what I wanted to pursue. And I had the fight, as it were, with my parents and my elders, none of whom could understand why I wanted to do what I wanted to do, which was to write books and explore topics like this. So yes, sometimes the person who is most vulnerable is the person who is most privileged. The young man who has whose dad has the multi-million-dollar company and is expected to take over that company and keep on being as wonderful as his father was. It's usually boys, of course, who get this type of coercion. And what I've noticed again and again is how often the son, on inheriting the business, makes a total mess of it, because he has very often just been handed everything, has not had time to make mistakes and learn and find out who he is. And this is to me is, well, it's no crime, but it's a failure really to come to terms with the inner person, the inner strengths that one might have. And there's nothing like reversal for doing that. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, orphans can be very, very loving and gentle and caring people. And if you ever feel bad and low and lonely, an orphan will know how that feels and will be very, very supportive. But similarly, a person who's been in the orphan phase will know this and be able to be supportive. So we have to differentiate between people who are still there and a bit stuck, and those people who have moved through this phase and said, yes, loving care for others is vitally important, but it's not the only thing that's important. We have to let people make their mistakes. We have to let them burn their fingers so that they know that it's possible to survive such minor mishaps. Again, I'm talking about people in their teens and their 20s. So this is a very interesting time. Most people, as far as I can see, most people in the world want to be a little bit anonymous, draw their pay, and have a comfortable life, which isn't too challenging. That's wonderful, but it's slightly limited. That's orphan thinking. That's not finding out the most about who you could possibly be, but it's safe, or it is perhaps safe for a while. Unfortunately, as Joseph Campbell said, the safe way is not always the safe way. And I give as an example the person who has always worked within a company, minding the rules, thinking whatever the company expects them to think. And in case you think I'm making this up, there's a whole class of people called company men in Japan who do exactly that. And then at around about the age of 55, they're aged out and they simply don't know what to do with themselves. They have no idea because they've never had to dig down to find out who's there. So orphans can be comfortable. It can be very nice, following the rules, doing what you're told to. But in the end, it's a barren landscape that awaits.
It is, because ultimately what you're not getting is the resilience to deal with the crisis, which is when I end up seeing people, is when they're in crisis. And the crisis comes because the model of life that they have, let's say, religiously followed, because it promised them that they would be okay if they just did this, this, and this, and this, whatever that might be, collapses. And now they're almost like catapulted into the pilgrim state, because they're having to be a stranger in a foreign land. But if they don't ask the questions, they just get stuck again in that orphan world of being in a strange land with nobody, instead of thinking, okay, let's see if I can find a map, and who can I talk to, and what does this mean? Those bigger questions, which then would lead to opportunities for self-discovery and for discovering other things. So this is the problem, and this is, I guess, as you say, some people can live very beautifully humble and happy lives at whatever stage they happen to be in. It's just when you hit a crisis and the landscape around you changes overnight, what do you do? Yes. And I think that's the perilous time, which is where when we're talking about the monarch, it's a very different situation. Now, what I liked about when you were talking about the archetype of the king and the queen is that we're talking here about the valuing of the masculine and the feminine. And we're not talking about men and women, we're talking about masculine and feminine, which are not to be confused with men and women. It's all of us having that inner balance, and that when we have that inner balance, actually we can relate to the opposite sex much better. And that's something that is an absolute truth. And I like the way that you talk about that through story as well as illustrated through story. I really did enjoy that very much.
Oh, good. Yes, I think you've got it absolutely right there. You know, the monarch pair, the king and queen, is a powerful pair, but we have to achieve the balance within ourselves, as you say. We have to be able to mobilize the masculine and the feminine within ourselves, not leave it up to someone else to do their half while we do the other half. So this is very important. But if you think about a king and a queen for a second, in ideal terms, you know, the king had to be able to know who to trust and to know who to promote, and also who was dangerous, and perhaps who had to be exiled or executed. So this isn't just sitting on a throne and giving orders. This is intelligent management of a situation. And the queen, on her side, because monarchs were almost always married. Queen Elizabeth I is perhaps the only example that most of us know of a monarch who wasn't married. The queen on her side has to be able to think in terms of not what is right and just, but what is humane and decent and loving. Because if a king is not loving to the subjects, that monarch pair is not going to last very long. If, you know, Marie Antoinette famously saying, "Let them eat cake," to the starving masses, she was not embodying any of the caring and loving aspects that we would hope the monarchy would embody. And so, not surprisingly, the French Revolution lopped off her head and her husband's too. This balance requires continual self-reflection. Am I being too stern because I can be? Am I being too weak because it comes naturally to me? What should I be? Am I allowing the growing young people in my family, however you describe your family, whether it's an extended family or a nuclear family, am I allowing them the space to be who they need to be so that they can be the best version of who they need to be? Which, of course, you hope is possible in any monarchy. What we get confused in, of course, is that one version of the king is the tyrant. That's what we hope to see. And the tyrant struts around giving orders. And we've seen enough of those in the 20th century, as well as in this century. You know, we've got quite a few very unpleasant examples. You know, Hirohito in Japan, Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. And that looks like a king, but in fact, it is merely a jumped up orphan. And such a person wants to keep the whole population in line as orphans, doing what they're told. Now, this is love gone wrong. And we need to learn to tell the difference between who is a genuine part of a monarch pair, allowing freedom, but also making sure the boundaries are kept, and someone who is just a tyrant telling people what to do. Unfortunately, humanity seems to like being told what to do. We seem to be very good at handing our power over to dictators. You know, Mao Zedong, extremely adept at what he did, but very, very destructive and very beloved at the time.
I was just thinking about, you know, these jumped up Orphans. And I was thinking about how when you said love gone wrong, actually what it is somebody who's been corrupted by fear and now can't love. And the kind of love they are offering is not love at all. It's become warped, distorted. It's, it's I will take care of you as long as you become my slave or my clone. And that's the kind of condition that is, it's not love at all. It is a complete corruption, and I think could only be described as fear, because it is intolerance, the opposite of what we expect from love, which is tolerance. And that brings me to the Magician. So because I like the way that you talk about the Magician as having the power to transform others. And I think the key to the ability to do that is the ability to achieve the holy grail of love, which is unconditional love.
I would say that was exactly right. The Magician is unconditionally loving and even loves those who are not very lovable or even downright evil, because they have their role to play too. Unconditional love, that's a phrase that's bandied around, isn't it? But it's really, really difficult. And maybe it even goes back to the Bible. Love your enemies as yourself. Whoa. I've met a few people in my life that I've found very, very hard to extend love to. But it's perhaps what we have to do. We shouldn't be trying to punish our enemies. Perhaps we should be trying to invite them to be a different version of themselves. But yes, unconditional love, how rare it is. Most of the people who come to me as clients have suffered from what I can only describe as very conditional love. You will be loved if you fit the way one parent or the other parent or both parents or even the whole family expects them to be. That's pretty coercive. The Magician, by contrast, is the one who says, well, I accept you as you are, because we're all imperfect and all complicated. But when we accept each other, something changes. We stop needing to fight. We stop needing to achieve. We stop living, as you say, in that place of fear. What is it that makes people feel unaccepted? Well, it's fear. They're afraid that they won't be accepted. And sometimes they haven't even bothered to find out or haven't been courageous enough to find out. But fear. There's love, there's fear. Choose one.
I like the fact that you devoted quite a lot of time to talking about courage in the book, because I think that is the secret of the Magician. The Magician has stopped being fearful. There is, he or she has the courage to love unconditionally, because it does take courage. If somebody is an actual threat to you, to be able to say, okay, well, I'm just going to separate myself from you because you're a threat to me. I'm going to, make sure that I am safe, but I'm not going to hate you. I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to love you. I think that's a courage that we all need to aspire to. That's acceptance, it's forgiveness. It's not naive because you're recognizing the threat, and it's not naive in the sense that you're condoning or tolerating it. It's saying, no, you stop there. You're not going to hurt me anymore, or you're not going to hurt anybody else anymore, but I can still love you. And I think that that's a tremendously difficult place to get to.
Yes. Yes. All of us can do it for a while, but it's hard to do it continuously. Yes.
It depends on how threatened we feel. So hopefully what we're talking about is a level of personal growth where we are confident enough and sure of ourselves enough, where we are able to give that grace up to others. But it's, there are going to be times when no matter how confident we are, there's room for more confidence in order to be able to be more forgiving.
Yes. Yes, yes. You put it very, very succinctly and very well. It's a difficult thing to pin down, but perhaps it's best understood if you compare the first stage, the innocent, with the magician. The innocent is loving and trusting, but has very few criteria. That's the way most of us are when we first fall in love. For a few moments or a few days or a few months, we are like newborn children, just loving and trusting. But what we need to learn as we go through the 6 stages and arrive, we hope, somewhere close to being magicians, is that what the magician has is the ability to discern, to feel those feelings of love and trust, but not to be led around by them by the nose. And that's a very different proposition.
Yes,
So,
it's distinguishing between love that's sustaining and sustainable and passion, which can burn out, shall we say. If this is an absolutely fascinating topic, of course, and we could spend hours discussing it. But I think the best thing I can say to our audience is the title of the book is The Six Archetypes of Love, From Innocent to Magician, by our guest today, Allan Hunter. Allan, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your wonderful insights again.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I think we get into some interesting conversations too. I hope your audience agrees.
I'm sure they do. On the notes to the podcast, you will find the link to Allan and how to contact him. You will find the link to his book. And I'm also going to put a link to the last time that Allan joined us and we talked about gratitude, so that if you missed it, you can easily get it, as well as the YouTube interview that we did on my channel, Life Astrologer. And next week, I will be speaking to author Bridget Finclair about her novel. Not often that I'm talking to someone about a novel, and you will see why it is that we're talking about a novel. Until then, goodbye.